Hello everybody, and welcome to my video explaining why I sincerely believe that no truly rational person accepts most of the versions of creationism that exist out there. Now, I think two of the biggest hurdles with creationists are getting them to think at all, and then getting them to admit to themselves that they could be wrong. Yet, if you can't get them over those first two hurdles, any further discussion is basically completely pointless. Now, this video is not an attack on faith or religious people. It's a focus on the rationality of a specific belief system, creationism, in light of scientific evidence. And now you probably realize that my main argument is that creationism, as a literal interpretation of the origin of life, is fundamentally incompatible with the vast and verifiable body of evidence from multiple scientific fields. And this is something I easily can and have talked about for hours at a time. So I'm going to try and keep this video in a watchable, manageable, length here. So this is the introduction. And let's move on to the next slide here. I've got this presentation to help me kind of keep this in a manageable amount of time. All right, so next, let's talk about what is creationism and evolution. Evolution is real quick and easy and concise for me to define. I can define it easily. I've defined it 100 times. Evolution is change in heritable characteristics, which are determined by the genetic alleles in populations of living organisms over time. Basically, that's it. It's caused by things like genetic drift, mutation, and natural selection, where novel traits are developed by changes in the genotype, which then introduce unique expressions in phenotype, some of which are beneficial to specific populations of organisms. And then, bam, you got a spike in reproduction because they're succeeding better at surviving, and etc. The old heritable variation and the struggle to exist. Now, creationism, this is where things can get complicated because there are different versions of creationism, and some of them are a little more reasonable than others. So there is all kinds of creationism. I didn't get all of them here. I can think of around a dozen or so. Some of the ones I didn't include are things like day age gap creationism, and there's some really bizarre Hindu versions of creationism that are like really, really old Earth creationism that say Earth is trillions of years old, which is another really weird, unique direct. Like I said, it's a vast array. It's a huge one of the issues with if you're gonna make some kind of scientific creationist thing is standardizing it, uh, getting everybody on the same model because there's so many different ones. But I got them organized here in kind of the tier of how bonkers and banane I think they are versus some of the more rational ones. So the most bonkers one is the one at the very top. Geocentric young earth creationists. These are like flat earthers who took the biblical literalism that is used to support creationism a step further than even most young earth creationists will take it, which is really bizarre because yeah, like it's weird. The overlap between those first two groups is definitely a very interesting issue because there are a lot of young earthers who really don't like flirfs. Like Peter Markley, he's a young earther who's on YouTube, and we've talked a couple times. He seems like a nice guy. But anyways, those are the two ones. These are the ones where it's like if I could snap my fingers and make two versions of creationism disappear, it would be those two because they are the absolute bottom of the barrel, most ridiculous. The bias and confirmation bias, the overconfidence, the arrogance is extreme in both of these worldviews. There's a lot of conspiracy thinking. It's really bizarre. So those are the first two. And then also to be kind of nice to some of the creationists and to, temper kind of the clickbaity title a little bit and say, it's not true that, nobody who's not truly these are some somewhat versions, rational versions of creationism, like old earth theistic evolutionist creationist, and there's a lot of overlap between these guys too. You'll have, pretty much all theistic evolutionists are going to say the earth is very ancient because that fits evolutionary model and geology and all that fun stuff. So it's a spectrum. On the creationist side and on the evolution side, it's a very clear specific model. It's a model in which heritable characteristics of populations of organisms change over time. Pretty much everybody will agree with that. Everybody. All right. And so one of the other reasons I don't think anyone who's truly rational believes in young earth creationism or flat earth creationism or day age gap or any of the other forms of creationism that deny populations of living organisms change over time via heritable variation and natural selection, all that fun stuff. There's also all this other evidence. It's like so many different lines of evidence that all support the same model. So just in like the first three of these things, right? We have almost the entire body of scientific evidence. Like, my mind truly staggers to say, like, when people think of evidence for evolution, they often only think of fossils, but the evidence is. It's not a single pillar. It's a massive interconnected network of evidence from nearly every list of science. So here's just the categories, right? This is one way you can more easily uh, you know, uh, uh, kind of condense all of the information into a palatable format. So there's the foundational concepts and observations, which is things like artificial selection. We've seen the species that was called Canis lupus turn into hundreds of varieties of Canis lupus familiaris, including ones that are definitely seem to have pre and post zygotic barriers to mating, like Chihuahuas and Great Danes. So that's observable change. And then you have genetics, which shows that everything's related, and you have fossils, which show these big macro evolutionary changes that happen over hundreds of millions of years. That's just the foundations, right? And then if you go in more specifically, number one expands first to the first three, and then the first three expand into basically all of science. So the paleo record is one of the most famous evidences. This is like the fact that even if I accept the young Earth worldview, I have to find a way to try and fit ancient Egypt and all these dates and stuff. I need to find a way to get to modern species like 400 years after the flood, and how I'm explaining all the other archaeological data of things like societies that existed during the alleged flood. So obviously the dates are wrong, or those how we're interpreting. There's so much stuff that you have to massage and reinterpret, and none of the ways they try to do it work. That's one of the major issues, right? The whole thing about science is that the best thing in science is the thing that explains all of the evidence really well without having to cherry pick it, and creationists have to cherry pick really bad. So transitional fossils are also a big part of the paleoscience too. You got things like Archaeopteryx, Myocetus, Dorudon. We'll talk about those a lot. We're going to get a lot more into them specifically in a little bit. And I do have two videos where I go into a great load more detail than we'll get into here. This is just touching on why all this evidence supports evolution and makes it hard for you to be considered a rational person by me and still reject it. So, genetics, genomics, and molecular biology. So we've got all these. This is a good example of like something that definitely would have falsified evolution. If when we had done genetic comparisons on humans and chimpanzees, they had been like 3% similar or 0% similar, that would have definitely falsified evolution. But instead, we found the exact opposite, that they're significantly similar, and pretty much every species on the planet is. Every two sets of species. So then you have comparative anatomy, biogeography, core biology, ecology, environmental. We won't go through every one of these categories because, again, they're explained in my other videos, and we're just trying to, establish that, oh my gosh, yes, there are all these categories of evidence of evolution. Another really good one is number where is it? Number 7 over here, ecology and environmental interactions. I talk about a lot in my second all the evidence of evolution video. Go watch both of those if you haven't watched them yet. Set aside 8 hours for delving into all the corners of science. But the reason we're not going to go into all these is because we don't have time, and we already did what we could of it on another video, and because with within those 14 categories of evidence, there's over 175 fields of science. Okay, so I debated this young earth creationist guy, Kent Hovind, and one of his things is he hates it if you bring up more than like 3 topics at a time. He's like, oh, you're trying to bring up 50. I got 175 fields of science. And a lot of these are built around the same data pool, so it's not as many numbers of data, but it's still like 20 different data pools. I almost want to see how many. You know what? I'm gonna put a minute on the clock and see how many of these I can read in a minute in my best, really fast reader announcer voice. All right, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm giving myself a full minute. Artificial selection, selective breeding, evolutionary biology, the overarching theoretical framework, experimental evolution, observed speciation in controlled laboratory and uncontrolled natural settings, perfect prediction, delineation of emergent forms, e.g. tick to leak, and ongoing new fossil discoveries per the law of faunal succession, evolutionary paleontology, paleobiology, forensic paleontology, paleoanthropology, paleobiology, paleobotany, paleoentomology, paleoepidemiology, paleoherpetology, paleotheology, paleolimnology, paleomology, paleoneurology, paleontology, paleozoology, taphonomy, transitional forms, comparative genetic analysis, environmental genomics, evolutionary genetics, genomics, immunogenetics, molecular biology, molecular evolution, paleogenetics, archaeogenetics, paleogenetics. Okay, all right. I won't do the whole thing. That was about 45 seconds, and I barely got through like not even 33% of this. It is basically the entire field of science. All of science is evolutionary science, and evolution is pivotal to countless scientific models that continue to build on it and find data that fits the current model or refines it. So much like how if when we had compared human and chimp genomes, we'd found 0% similarity. Another way evolution could have been falsified is if when we looked into things like the fossil record, we had found nothing but modern species, right? Like if there's nothing but rabbits and cats and humans, all the way down to the bottom of whatever we can dig up and look at, then absolutely evolution would have been falsified. There would have been no evidence that life has changed over the course of time on Earth. But obviously, that isn't what we actually found, and this is part of what this chart is exhibiting. At the lowest levels, you got nothing but these trilobites, these squids, these arthropods, and some really, simple ocean plants or some ocean animals like corals and sessile filter feeders, and you got a couple more complex animals like your trilobites and some of your kind of horseshoe crabs looking type stuffs. And then as you go up, you got more unique, complex types of plants. So, like, one of the big things that's tough for the creationists, and part of why it's tough to be somebody who, more impartial person would consider a rational person who accepts creationism is this right here, the Carboniferous. There is a stage at which plant life exploded onto the planet, but creationism, the way the day and stuff is described, it doesn't fit the actual order. Like, really, at the lowest level, we've got these microorganisms and stuff down here, your archaeas and polypeptides, and like things that are technically not alive fully because they don't do everything we consider a living thing to do. It's one of those bleeding edges of scientific theories where things get really wonky and really complex. And then up here, we start to get animals and plants all at the same time until plants explode onto land. So none of how the Bible describes this really fits. The facts that, this Carboniferous thing exists is a major problem for that. And then the specific details of the Carboniferous, that the reason plants exploded onto land is because of things like what eventually became referred to as the Great Oxygenation Event, which was important for plants that use, you know, carbon dioxide for photosynthesis and animals that use oxygen for breathing, but it was bad for a lot of things that weren't adapted to an oxygen environment. But as a result, one of the things you get was plants, these plants that exploded onto land over time. And some of the early plants weren't even technically just plants. Like, one of my favorites are called lichens, liverworts, and mosses. These are the brytophytes. They are plants that technically don't have, veins or more of the complex structures that more derived plants have, like stems and leaves and all that stuff. Some of them aren't even actually true plants, like the lichens, which are an obligate symbiote. They are an endosymbiosynthetized colony of algae and fungi cells. They're obligate symbiotes that will die without each other. But none of this is really bad for creationism, this chart, and the fact that anybody can go out and actually dig into the earth and find what fits this whole chart here is a demonstration of this thing called the law of monophyly, which says that every fossil that we dig up and every extant species fits into a pattern where all of these things are related. And a good example of that is things like the major phyla in the kingdom Animalia, which many of those are represented here. We've got, cnidarians and arthropods and mollusca and chordats, and yeah, we've got pretty much all of them here. So really bad for creationism, hard to be a rational guy when you believe in this stuff. And on to the next slide. So another one of the reasons why it's really hard to be somebody I would consider truly rational while being one of the versions of creationists that rejects evolution is the fact that we have all these really, really well completed evolutionary lineages. It's literally a meme of Futurama where the ape professor is arguing with Professor Farnsworth and he's all, I don't want to live on this planet anymore. It's because of things like this, like horse evolution. Here I've just included two. not to confuse you with the huge web, and I can't fit it all on my laptop, but I can give you some of the names. So we've got Hyrocotherium. That's this one here on the left. That's the, well, my left. I think it should be your left too. Well, I've got them labeled anyway, so you should follow it that way. Hyrocotherium. It's the earliest horse ancestor, small and dog-like with multiple toes, whereas you have, going along the line, larger horses like Mesohippus and Merychippus, which keep getting larger and getting teeth and toes more like modern horses. The teeth and toes are for them adapting to the plain grazing style of living, until you get your Pliohippus, which is much closer to modern horses with the fully developed single toe, which is basically what the hoof is, which is what you end up getting in the modern Equus here. And this is a beautiful line. It's a complex line with a wealth of fossil evidence showing clear progressions of traits over time. And while there are debates about specific branches and relationships within the lineage, the overall picture of horse evolution is well established and it continues to be uncovered. And one of my favorite things about it is the fact that horse, rhino, and tapir ancestors all look almost exactly the same, and they can take decades to tell the difference apart that between them and tell which species is which. And but evolutionary biologists can, and creationists can't, and never will be able to, because they're not really actually interested in figuring stuff like that out, and evolutionary biologists are, which is why increasingly less and less of them are people that you could consider truly rational and are just, religious ideologues. And I hate to use charged language like that, but that's where I'm at. So horses are one of my favorite lines because they're what's called an ethnozoological species. They're one that has evolved alongside humans. Everything that evolves is technically co-evolving. Nothing evolves in a vacuum, but horses have evolved alongside us, and we've adapted them into all kinds of different types, much like we've done with canines and felids. But this one is another one of my favorite lines because of how well it it demonstrates the way evolution is put together in a scientific method by using converging lines of evidence. That is, lines of evidence that match each other and all support the same basic conclusion. And so here we've got some, basic uh, screen art stock picture of some humpback whales. These are baleen whales. There are two main types of whales that exist today. Those would be the baleen and the toothed whales. Technically, both whales have teeth. Baleen whales just have a specific kind of hairy structure inside of their mouths that they is what they use for feeding more than teeth, because they are filter feeders who feed on enormous amounts of krill, little tiny shrimpy boys in the ocean. And the evolutionary lineage of whales is a fascinating example because not only you got all those different lines of evidence, it's also a major transition. It's even-toed, ungulate, quadrupedal land mammals going to ocean mammals. It's a huge transition from a fully land to fully aquatic lifestyle. And we're going to get into a little bit of a simplified overview of the members of the family. And but first, let's talk about how the whale evolution lines of evidence are such a good explanation of the interdisciplinariness. And there's a great video that explains this very well on the channel, stated clearly, that I will probably link in the description of the video or in one of the comments, that explains it really well as well. And I'm going to try and boil it down really fast so we don't have the length of a whole entire other video in this video. If you want to learn more, you can go and watch that video. But the basic of it is, so first you get fossil data. That's line one. You've got fossils of even-toed ungulate quadruped land mammals in the fossil record, and you see these fossil species. Things are happening to them over the course of time as they are piling up in the genetic data. That chart, the uh, layers of strata, that chart I showed you earlier, they are doing things like their nasal cavity is moving up the skull to the top of their head, more like a blowhole, like a modern whale has. They are getting smaller and smaller rear legs until eventually they disappear. And those rear legs were probably used for things like scratching or digging in mud, like even when they were very small, and slowly getting more and more useless until totally disappearing. And then you have them doing things like their forelimbs are becoming more rudder like, but they still have all of those even toed ungulate quadruped skeletal bone parts. And then, so that's the fossil data. And then the next line of data is embryological and developmental data. When you look at a whale, dolphin, cetacean fetus in utero in developmental stages, they all develop leg buds. Usually, the leg buds get absorbed by the rest of the body plan due to evolutionary process called apoptosis. It's basically controlled cell death. But because it is an evolved process, sometimes what it does is it produces the ancestral body plan instead of the modern one. It expresses the genotype in the old way instead of the new way. And you get infant dolphins and whales that are born with atavistic leg buds, have them their whole life, all right, that don't get absorbed by the body plan. So that is fossil and then embryological, developmental, microbiological evidence. And then you get the last, which is the third line. But technically, these, again, much like the categories, this is all like 6 or 7 different lines. It's the genetic evidence. If you compare whales, cetaceans, with all other organisms, it's another good example where we could have got something that falsified evolution. If they had been more similar to ocean organisms, any ocean organism, besides the ones in the category cetacean, than even-toed ungulate quadruped land mammals, evolutionary biologists might have had to been like, oh, okay, maybe these creationist guys got something. We might have to throw this model out or remodel it again. No, they are more similar to hippos and other even-toed quadruped ungulate land mammals, ectotherms. They share all these same phylogenetic taxonomical divisions and diagnostic criteria. And as a result, they're more, of course, more genetically similar. And so it's all these different lines. And then, of course, there's the individual species, which we'll go over those a little bit too. Okay, this is one of my favorites. This guy right here, Myocetus, he is very transitional. He's like still really good at both of the things he does, which are living on land and getting food in the water. So he's well built to spend long hours in the water just chowing down and then finding a place on land to scurry around to sleep for a while before going back into the water for more chowing down. And of course, you have a lot of others besides just Myocetus. You have Indohyus, the earliest ancestor, who's a small deer-like mammal with adaptations for semi-aquatic life. You get Pakicetus. I think Myocetus is in between Indohyus and Pakicetus, or in between Pakicetus and Ambulocetus. But you get a bunch of cetuses, which are Pakicetus, Ambulocetus, Rhodocetus, and these are just becoming more streamlined, becoming more aquatic. Then you have Basilosaurus, which is a fully aquatic whale with a long serpentine body, small hind limbs, and Basilosaurus is a great example of that nasal cavity move to blowhole movement. Then Dorudon is the last one we found in the line so far where it still has those tiny legs. They're extremely small. I imagine some Dorudons were possibly born without legs. They were very close to that point. And then you got odontocetes. These are toothed whales and mysticetes, baleen whales, the modern main groups of whales that follow the distinct evolutionary paths. And the third example of a great evolutionary line for illustrating why I think there aren't any really truly rational people that are still denying evolution. This one is great because it is usually the one that a creationist or evolution denier cannot accept. It is the one, this was one of the ones that was quintessential historically. Aristotle had the concept of man as being unrelated, above animal kingdom, because he is the only one with a rational soul, which is very arrogant and anthropocentric. But this is a great line of evidence for evolution, and it's a great example of why it's not rational to be a creationist. I have seen a fantastic stream done by one of the many great evolution and science communicating YouTubers on this social media platform. Planet Peterson did a great video of, there's no evidence for evolution. He superimposed this video on the top. He's got, creationists saying there's no evidence for evolution. And he's just looking up like, what is that, And yeah, I keep this one handy just to give it to creationists, because this one doesn't have all the information on it. And I'll ask them, which ones do you think these are? And of course, they always say, oh, they're full humans, they're full apes. You're not likely to get the actual taxonomy, which this one, the one on the very top left, is Australopithecus afarensis, and then this one over here down on the very bottom right is, of course, modern Homo sapiens, and we got Neanderthalensis and Denisovans. All the human sibling species are like the last six, and then you got Paranthropus and some other ones in the middle, like Aerogaster, and of course, I have a better, more complete chart for you too. But creationists, yeah, they just can't handle it. They won't accept these things. They won't accept that humans are apes and are related to apes. And this is one of the places where they're most irrational, and their lack of rationality is glaring in the anthropocentric views they have, their inability to see that humans are just animals, they're mammals, endothermic primate, mammals, bilateral, all these things that just categorize us as, the different types of things that are alive instead of not being alive, which should be really simple. But if you're rational, it should be really simple. But that's the point of the video, right? So we talked about this with the whales, about how the whale evolution line is so great because it shows all the intersections of evolution, and that big list I wrote shows how all these, this is just a very small snippet of all the cross confirmation uh, independent lines of evidence for evolution. These aren't isolated finds or wild guess. They are chains of evidence, each fossil a piece in a puzzle that has been put together over decades by thousands of scientists. And these are just a few of the many such lineages we have. None of these have been debunked, no matter how many times creationists claim they have. It is what, and I know exactly, I can put my creationist hat on and say what I think their response will be. Oh, this is just storytelling. That is like being in a court of law where somebody is on trial for murder, and the person on trial, the murderer confessed, Dozens of people have saw it and have given eyewitness testimony that all fits each other. It was recorded, so you have video evidence as well. The murder weapon was immediately apprehended by highly trustworthy police officer, and you have all this information, that all these different lines of evidence that all fit each other, and saying, well, this is just a story, so fully acquitted, put him back on the streets, let him stab some more people allegedly. We can't know for sure. It's all just storytelling, which unfortunately is generally the kind of level of critical thinking and response I get from creationists in response to these kinds of points. So let's talk about that a little bit. Some of the things that creationist apologists say. We won't go through every single argument, but let's touch on some of the common ones. I got three common ones here. They'll say it's just a theory. Well, that's technically true, but it's not. They're being dishonest. They're using a uh, etymological fallacy there. Evolution is both a colloquial theory, as in a loose set of ideas about something, but it's also a scientific theory. It's a theory that there's all this scientific evidence for, which scientific evidence is data which may or may not support a specific model or hypothesis, like I explained previously. It's about quantifiable, falsifiable, possible solutions to unanswered questions and unsolved problems that we are trying to answer and solve so that we can better understand the universe. But creationists, of course, don't understand that. Missing links, that's another one they use a lot. We talked about that a little bit already, but it's an especially irritating one because as the quintessential, okay, whatever, I'll just keep rolling with it. The quintessential meme showed, uh, if you show a missing link, they just say now there's another missing link between the missing link and the links you had previously. So for every missing link you find, there it makes two more ones, and that was kind of the point of the Futurama meme. And then I forget what the last one on the original one says. We'll just move on. So this is an important slide here because, oh yeah, here we go. Just a theory. What about the missing link? The second law of thermodynamics. I'm glad I remembered because that is an important one. So the second law of thermodynamics is one they use in a technobabbly way because it sounds very convincing if you interpret it a way that is not the way it's actually interpreted when it's being used in physics. It's misrepresenting and conflating the words entropy, order, and disorder, which means something different in physics. In reality, the second law of thermodynamics, what it really means is all the heat and energy will get all mixed up and then it'll gradually smooth out over time, which is actually necessary for evolution to happen because during that getting all mixed up part, that is where all the energy and matter gets mixed up. And then as it cools down, it starts to form all these elements that are necessary to form like the biomolecules that cells inside of more complex multicellular organisms are made out of. So actually, the second law of thermodynamics supports evolution. But now we're going to we're going to pivot to asking why creationism fails instead of addressing the arguments creationists make about evolution. And there are a lot of really good reasons for that. And these first two are my favorite. It's just the fact that they presume their conclusion. They are using the entirely different wrong model for actually figuring out what the truth is to something. Their model is decide it was God, think that forever, no matter what contradictory evidence there is. If there is any, if you are forced to accept it, find a way to explain it that still allows for God. And if you can't, you'll have to say it's fake or find some way to hand wave it away as irrelevant or something like that. So that's a big part of the problems. These other four, those are specific, those are all 100% logos. The first one's kind of like about ethos. All four of those are 100% logos. The heat problem is a great one because that just is a knockout punch for any attempt to explain a young Earth model can work because it absolutely can't. Radiometric dating, radiometric decay, tectonic plate movement, limestone lithification. All these processes, basically every process on the planet produces some amount of heat, and if you can do detective work to piece together processes and how much heat, and if you do the math, if you're going with a young earth creationist timeline, the total heat that you can find is like a kind of like heat accountant ledgering all the heat up. If you try and have that released over a span of time that's only like 6,000 years long, it obliterates the planet. It's enough heat that it boils the ocean and melts the planet into a superheated plasma hot enough that it's hotter than the surface of the sun. And I'll put another video link in the description for this to one of my favorite channels, Erica Gutsick. She shouted me out on a live chat today, so I gotta give her a shout out right back. She said I'm a cool dude. Erica, you're a cool gal, and your heat problem videos are very hot. Anyways, so that's the heat problem. And then the mud problem. This is another one she covered too. I actually knew about the three other problems. She was the one who introduced me to the top problem, but I was actually kind of onto it already because of some parallel thinking. But she introduced me to it and showed me that it's been around since the 90s, which like blew my mind because it's such a big problem and it's so good. Anyways, the other three, the mud problem, the food problem, the inbreeding problem. So the first one, the mud problem, is another geological problem. The thing about the heat problem and the mud problem is that they're both just development problems. When you look out into reality, you see amounts of development. You see mountainous development, volcanic development, meteorological development, all these different kinds of development that occur over uniformitarian processes, as we now know, thanks to things like geology and meteorology and climatology and all that fun stuff. The other two are logistical problems about the actual Noah's flood model of history where all these species were on a boat. You can't get enough biomass to feed that many species. And obviously, even if you can and they can survive that long, once they hit Mount Ararat, the planet's been covered with water for it's almost a whole year. There's nothing for the primary consumers to feed on. So there's no producers. And so you just dropped a bunch of primary consumers with all of their predators in the same spot, and there's no food for the primary consumers to eat. So these are logistical problems, just logic problems, just things where it's like, this doesn't make sense. This can't work. And then lastly, of course, the inbreeding problem, where if all of these other, even if somehow all of these other problems are avoidable, if you get a population of organisms to just down to like just 2 or 7, according to how you're reading the book, I think some of them there was 7 of them, some of them there was just 2. Those animals are going to be so mutated by inbreeding in just a dozen consecutive generations of inbreeding, guaranteed population collapse. No population will ever come back from just 2 or 7 individuals. It's just not conceivable. Not unless they can be absorbed by a larger population that is, either hasn't changed enough due to adaptive radiation. You see how these problems are so, oh man, and it can be tough to articulate in a moment, especially when you got a really like one of those really hard ass young earth creationists who's like a tough guy. He's like, oh, yeah, yeah, like won't let you make a point over him and is constantly just droning on all of the apologia they've heard. They're not really listening. They're not using the part of their brain where you need to flex it in order to unlearn old bad information and replace it with new information, which is a skill all too many people don't practice. But anyways, these are why creationism fails. A big part of why there's no truly rational people who are young earth creationists, especially, but many varieties of creationists. So this is kind of a continuation of some of the previous arguments and criticisms I've made, but it's one that's phrased incredibly well, and I heard someone else say it once, and it was really enlightening for me. And it is this: creationists have a presupposed dogmatic conclusion that they will never discard, no matter how much evidence contradicts it, nor how well they are shown the evidence contradicts it. If evidence, logic, rationality, empiricism, and science indicate a conclusion that goes against the dogmatic conclusion, they will not decide the dogmatic conclusion is wrong. They will decide the evidence, logic, rationality, empiricism, and science is wrong. Whereas evolution is an evidence and usefulness based scientific theory, if the scientific community could actually be shown that evolution isn't the most useful theory for understanding and working with the data in the field, they wouldn't use it. They use it because it is the best. If there was any evidence another model was the best, that is the model they would be using in hundreds of fields of science. But it's not. Evolution is that model. And here we have a picture of the tragic Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake for daring to say the earth was ancient and spherical and circled around the sun instead of the other way around. He gave his life for science. He is one of the giants whose shoulders we stand on, and he paid the ultimate price for the only crime of being decades and decades and decades ahead of his time as a brilliant thinker and a scientific mind. R.I.P. Giordano. You were done so wrong, my boy. Yeah, I think Giordano alone is a good illustration for how dark the irrationality of creationism can be, but it can be even darker. A good example of that is trepanning. Look that up if you're not interested. If you're interested in more of the darkness that reigned before the scientific revolution, when spectral evidence was king. Trepanation was when they would put holes into people's head because they thought mental distress was caused by demonic entities and bad spirits instead of, biopsychosocial causes like we now know. But these are other really good specific contradictions. Koalas, kangaroos, and marsupials of Australia is a great contradiction because not only do you, okay, so all those problems listed previously, imagine they can survive all of those. They can survive all the inbreeding. How the heck do the koalas and kangaroos and marsupials get back to Australia from Mount Ararat, hopping across the ocean, swimming, picking up every piece of fur and hair they drop so that they don't leave any fossils along the way? It's just not, it's hilariously improbable. It's really ridiculous. Then the Carboniferous, we talked about that specifically a little bit already. The Cambrian explosion. This is one creationists sometimes bring up themselves. But it shows evolutionary changes, major macroevolution happening faster than it usually does, but still at geological rates. Big killer for creation. It's a hammer in their coffin. It's a nail in their coffin, rather, but it's one that they sometimes ironically try to use. It's funny. I think it's a real demonstration of the ignorance being one of the core problems. And then sediment layers, dry cenotes, and river deposition. These are all like lithological, limnological, geological, uniformitarian processes. These are things that happen on a seasonal cycle. We know every summer, every spring that the cenote is dry, and then every winter it gets wet and it deposits, and so on and so forth. And none of them fit a 6,000 year number of the earth over and over again. We find that it's just not possible. The Green River Formation is a great one. It's got, all these hundreds of thousands of deposits in the alleged 1 year flood, and it's none of this stuff fits. It makes that as hard one to be somebody who can be considered rational. And then lastly, there's just the nature of faith versus evidence. A truly rational person accepts the overwhelming evidence for evolution. They're capable of using the part of their brain where they unlearn bad old information and replace it with new good information. Flat, young earth, God of the gaps. None of this is rational. It's not a rational belief. It's based on question begging, which is basically just another word for faith. The reason faith is worse than evidence and rationalism based methods, we've been over this Evidence and rational based methods give you good medicine. Faith-based methods give you trepanning and bloodletting. And then, so we've talked a lot about why it's not rational to be a creationist. Let's pivot a little bit for the last bit of this here and talk instead about why it is rational and great to be somebody who accepts evolution, the evolutionary liberation. One of the big things is we better understand ourselves. We understand that we're mammals with haphazard brains that go crazy and do weird things sometimes because they're a result of evolution. You can end up taking damage and becoming somebody else because your consciousness is in your evolution derived brain. We have things like planetary mortality and mass extinctions on our radar. We want to do something to help save the world, whereas creationists have already accepted the world as doomed, basically. It's a part of their prophecy for the world. And in this way, evolution is not bleak at all. It's realistic, but it's full of hope. It's full of ideas for how we can better fit biosphere and biodiversity and even keep it flourishing and allow ourselves to flourish because the biosphere is flourishing. But, it can't do that while also supporting mass production based hyper consumerist capitalism. But, that's a whole other discussion. And lastly, I mean, this is just our example. It's not all of them, but these are some big ones that immediately come to mind. It can be supported with evidence. It can be studied. If I'm not satisfied with evolution, there's more and more books I can read. I'm never going to run out of books that teach me more about evolution that I didn't already know. Creationism, I've read maybe a dozen, maybe 2 dozen books by creationists, and they all repeat each other all the time. It's basically the same thing every time. It's the irreducible complexity and technobabble and all of the other points I already addressed. And so, this is my reasons for why I think no true rational person accepts creationism, and all kinds of rational, awesome people accept theistic evolution and atheistic evolution and all kinds of cool science that's really good for the world. And I think if you want to help make the world better, you don't have to be somebody who goes out and studies evolution and becomes an evolutionary scientist like I'm doing. You can just say, yeah, I don't think you're rational when people say things like there's no evidence for evolution. And if they say, "Oh yeah, prove it," just link them to this video. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great one.